I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our 2020 update podcast. We didn't have an update podcast last year because we didn't need one. But this year, there are a few things to update you on, starting with Little Women.
Well, you may remember that in 2017 there was a new adaptation of Little Women, 3-part miniseries that I told you that I liked. And while that was going on, I was aware that there had been made and was shortly to be released in the United States a modern retelling of Little Women. And shortly after that, I found out that what they called a traditional adaptation of Little Women was also in the works. Now I have managed to see both of those. The modern retelling, overall, I didn't like it, and I think there were really two reasons for that. One is that it being set in the present day, but trying to do the same kind of story and themes and things as the original, kind of stopped it making sense, which isn't what the filmmakers wanted to go for at all. I think they wanted to say, look how relevant Little Women still is. The same kinds of problems and relationships and lives are still going on today, but they had to make so many changes to the setup, to the characterization, that it didn't really work for me. A lot of it was rather forced as well, like instead of reading out a letter from father, they FaceTime him. They go to the bother of doing that, but so that Amy can burn Joe's book, they have to make up all sorts of reasons why she doesn't want to save any of it digitally. There's this scene where Laurie's saying, you could use my laptop if you wanted, and she's saying, what if your laptop crashes? And it's all rather forced where they want the technology and where they don't. And of course, it's not just about tech and stuff, is it? It's about lifestyles and ideals and what people do and where they go, and it just kind of didn't make sense.
I don't think it's a good idea to set things in a different time than the one they're supposed to be set in. Art is a product of its time, and you're going to take away some of the sense if you start trying to be too clever and muck about with the times. Obviously, nowadays, there's absolutely no way that Amy burning a paper copy of Joe's book would matter. Joe would have countless digital copies of it in various places. It just doesn't make sense. And it rather undermines the point, I think, about the feelings and the lessons and the interactions still being relevant in the modern age. Yes, of course, they are still relevant in modern times, but why not let them speak for themselves by seeing the story in its correct setting, rather than forcing it into contemporary times and making it make no sense?
And the other problem is that Joe is a right bitch. With the occasional exception of Laurie, who is meant to be her friend, she enters every scene, every situation by being just horrible and aggressive to whoever's in it. She will pick a fight with Amy when Amy's never even said anything. She will march up to Professor Bear, who is on this committee of writers who decide if they're going to have people on their creative writing course at the university, which Joe doesn't get on, so it's okay that they end up together. She doesn't have a kind word to say to Aunt March, who's really not that bad in this adaptation, and she's just horrible. And in the scene where Amy does burn Joe's paper book of writing and notes, I really found I was cheering her on, because Joe was being so unnecessary and saying very much the sorts of things that upset a younger sibling very much. And it was a spur-of-the-moment thing when Joe said, Laurie doesn't like you, he thinks you're stupid and immature just like the rest of us, or something like that, she says. If somebody said that to me, I might be tempted to burn their book as well. So overall it didn't work very well, although I thought the cast was well chosen. Everybody certainly looked the part, and I do remember thinking I would like to see this lot in a traditional adaptation. And the one actor who was in it who I think is actually worth mentioning by name is Lee Thompson, who we talked about before in our Back to the Future podcast, as Marmee, and I thought she looked like and acted like a very good Marmee. And for the the only time since the 1994 adaptation, which I like best, they've gone to the trouble of casting an older and a younger Amy. And I thought that worked very well. And I thought it was a shame that the film really didn't work, and they took some very bad decisions with the writing and directing of Jo. I'm sure that actress could have done a perfectly fine job with better material, but it was certainly interesting to see, and I suppose it had its moments. And I remember reading a blog that somebody had written about it, saying what was interesting about a modern adaptation was that Meg becomes the unconventional one, and she gets a certain amount of looking down on for deciding to marry young and be a housewife and have babies in this day and age. So we've had 2017 miniseries, 2018 modern retelling, and 2019 theatrically released traditional adaptation, which was all over the internet. And the writer-director Greta Gerwig was probably the loudest of those voices on the internet. She announced her vision for Little Women with, as it seems to me, a great deal of self-congratulation. And I was fairly excited to go and see this in the cinema. And I read a lot about it before I saw it. One of the things I read was that it was going to be non-linear. One of Greta Gerwig's self-congratulatory announcements was, well, I've had this really brilliant idea of mainly it's Little Women Book 2 or Good Wives, and it's a little-known fact that Little Women was originally published in 2 volumes and we're focusing on the 2nd volume. In this country, Greta Gerwig, it's always published in the 2 volumes, or if it is published in one, it will very clearly say it's Little Women and Good Wives. And I think a lot of Americans do know that, actually. And the other thing she said that she thought sounded like a really amazing idea was that it's all about how women judge each other, and there are certain views on what feminism is and what women should and shouldn't do, but actually women's choices are all perfectly valid. And I do remember thinking both of those things, both of those USPs, as Greta Gerwig has suggested that they are, had already been announced, probably not too long before she started on her screenplay, as things that the modern retelling were attempting. So I'm not convinced that Greta Gerwig thought of those things herself. And as it turned out, both of them were done more clearly, even if you don't want to say better, in the modern retelling. Can you tell I don't think very much of Greta Gerwig? Well, she is going on the Olden Days podcast blacklist. When I did eventually get to see the film after about a year of anticipation and a lot of media hype and critics saying it was so wonderful and do you think this Little Women movie will be definitive and all kinds of things like that, I finally got to go and see it, and I thought it was not particularly well done at all, actually. And I thought that she properly screwed up her idea of a non-linear timeline. And I do remember thinking you could make that work if you really truly are going to mainly adapt Good Wives, as we call it in this country, and have thematically linked bits from Little Women. For instance, when Sally peer pressures Meg into buying silk to make a dress with that John cannot afford, you could flash back to the coming out party where Sally and friends peer pressure Meg into dressing up and being something she's not. When you're having Amy and Laurie finding out that they're going to marry each other in Europe, you could flash back to the one thing that they really do in book 1 that most of the adaptations make something of, which is where he persuades her to go to Aunt March's to avoid scarlet fever with no more fuss and that kind of thing, and keep a clear present day. And then to make the flashbacks a bit clearer, I think it would be a good idea to have different people play the sisters, get some actual CYPs to play Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy, and I do think that fans would like to see that. And I think that you would have to be prepared to sacrifice some elements of the story that don't fit in with your adaptation of mainly Good Wives. And Greta Gerwig did none of those things. One criticism by viewers that I have read, whether they liked the film overall or not, was that if they were unfamiliar with the story, they had absolutely no idea what time period was what. I don't think that the film was more Book 2 Good Wives than Book 1 Little Women. It came across very much as starting two-thirds of the way into the story and then randomly going back and doing a bit from Book 1 and then coming back to Book 2 and carrying on where that left off and then going back in time again, and there was absolutely nothing relevant to what we'd just been seeing. And I can see what those people mean. If I didn't know the story, I would have no idea what was going on.
It really struck me that if you knew less than I know about Little Women, which isn't a tremendous amount, but it's a decent amount, the film really wouldn't make any sense at all. You wouldn't know what time period you were supposed to be in. You wouldn't know how one period related to the other at all. And that's certainly a mistake if you're hoping to appeal to a wide audience.
Of course, besides bits of the flashbacks being irrelevant, she was smushing things together, wasn't she? Meg's getting in the coach to go to the coming out party, and Grandfather is saying, "Oh, do come over and play the piano." And then when Beth does go over and play the piano, she's about to get scarlet fever, and she's already got it when she's taking him his slippers that she's made for him. Basically, you need to be a competent screenwriter if you're going to attempt non-linear, and I don't think that Greta Gerwig is, and I don't like her, and I'm slagging her off big time because I feel that she really crapped on an opportunity that somebody else could have utilised much better. Of course, it's got a very famous cast and a very very active media campaign, and a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's brilliant, it's so original, it's such a new, different, exciting adaptation." Kind of works, and it makes people think they've enjoyed the film, and perhaps they did enjoy the film, and it has got some good reviews and some good responses. Two veteran actresses, Meryl Streep as Aunt March and Laura Dern as Marmee.
I thought Laura Dern was very good as Marmee. Very maternal, very heartfelt performance.
I do remember thinking Laura Dern was the only one who really made any attempt to make us care when Beth died. Greta Gerwig certainly didn't. She smushed together the scarlet fever from which Beth recovered with her death, so you've got absolutely no time to process what happened the first time and be relieved and stick with Beth a bit longer and then feel the impact of, oh, she's not going to make it after all. And then after she died, we go to a flashback where she's there. It was completely senseless, and Laura Dern acted the grieving mother very, very well, and really the writing and directing and editing and structure of the film ruined it. Then there's Saoirse Ronan as Jo, and I've seen Saoirse Ronan in Atonement when she was a young teenager, and I thought she was very good in that. And I've seen her in Little Women, and I've seen her in Mary Queen of Scots, and I thought her best performance actually was in Atonement when she's younger. I think she might have gone to a few too many acting classes and become a bit too polished and less honest in her performances. She's kind of acting more on the outside than from the inside. That's what I thought, but she was fine as Jo. And for Meg, they wanted Emma Stone to begin with, and I've not seen Emma Stone in anything that I can remember, but she couldn't do it. And the next choice was Emma Watson, and I do remember thinking, Emma Watson as Meg? Emma Watson is always very engaging and likeable on the screen, I think, and she does her acting a certain way, and it is always pretty much the same, and that kind of acting isn't really Meg, is it? The performance was Emma Watson attempting an American accent, which Americans say is terrible, and ironically, Emma Stone couldn't do it because she was busy promoting a film, The Favourite, in which she does a really bad English accent. Amy is played by Florence Pugh, rather like Saoirse Ronan, an actress I hadn't heard of until I found out she was going to be in Little Women, and then I started reading about her, and she's been in a lot of things lately and got famous lately, and I watched her in Lady Macbeth, which was a very peculiar film, and she was 24, I think, when they filmed Little Women, and she was playing grown-up Amy and child Amy, and she's not a child. It seemed like the director, Greta Gerwig's answer to that was to have her look like a 24-year-old and act like a 4-year-old. I thought the attempts to make Amy seem like a child made her very bratty, unlikable, and it wasn't very convincing, really, but I thought Florence Pugh was good in Lady Macbeth. I'm sure she's fine in other things. I think, like pretty much everyone else, she hasn't been able to showcase her talents particularly well in this film.
I found Amy much too aggressive in the movie. I don't know if it was Florence Pugh's fault or Greta Gerwig's fault, probably Greta Gerwig. But rather like Jo in the modern retelling, I thought she was just very, very aggressive to everybody. I thought the bit where she was at school with a load of children and she was obviously at least 10 years older than all of them was absolutely ridiculous and looked like crap. And I didn't like the bit where she was explaining in literal terms why it's hard to be a woman in these times as part of the script, telling Laurie about it. And Jo did that at one point as well, with Marmee. Obviously, Marmee already knew, but Jo was discussing it in her own way in relation to her own particular struggles. And as you were saying to me, we live in the age of overstatement, which I think is a shame. As I was saying before, let these things speak for themselves.
And then Beth is played by an Australian young actress called Eliza Scanlon, and actually Beth is quite missable in the film.
I couldn't visualise her for several scenes. I knew she'd been in it, but I couldn't remember which one she was or what she looked like or what she'd been saying or doing.
And another criticism by other people that I've read is that Beth is underused. And I thought she played the part well, and I would have liked to see her play the part in a better structured film where you can spot her a bit more easily within the first few minutes. Laurie is played by Timothée Chalamet, who is very popular at the moment. If you read people commenting, their opinion is generally, he's so cute, he's so adorable. He does look kind of like Laurie is described in the book, more like the actor who played him in the retelling. I said everyone looked the part. Laurie was the exception in the modern retelling, but even so, he played the part very well. John Brooke is Meg's husband John in the later timeline, and Mr. Brooke, the tutor, in the earlier timeline. How long, if you didn't know the story, would it take you to work out that they are the same person? And he's played by somebody called James Norton. There's Father, he's played by somebody called Bob Odenkirk. He's really rather forgettable, I think. And there's Friedrich, who's played by somebody with a name that's difficult to pronounce, Louis or Louis Grabiel or something like that. And again, he does a perfectly reasonable performance as Friedrich, but the structure is so weird. The attempts to be ambiguous about whether he and Jo get married or not make it kind of difficult for him.
She wanted to have her cake and eat it too, with that ambiguity about those two, didn't she, Greta? But whatever happened, you can tell from the end scene that Jo has persuaded Friedrich to stay and teach at Plumfield, at least, if not marry her. So why try and be ambiguous about, did she rush after him to the station or not? Well, obviously she did, otherwise he wouldn't be there.
Does Greta Gerwig not know Bronson Alcott opened a school from which all the white children withdrew after he admitted one black child, which was alluded to subtly in the 1994 film? Jo's school at Plumfield, with pretty much half and half black children and white children, is historically inaccurate. And again, she's done it because she's trying to overstate. There were black people in Massachusetts at this time. Well, okay, yes, there were, and you're right to put them in the film where you would have found them at that time, which is not in a school run by any of the Alcotts or any of their fictional counterparts.
When we did our Red Dwarf podcast, the latest news was that Red Dwarf 13 had been commissioned by Dave and was on its way sometime in 2020. As it turned out, not long before the thing actually showed up, only a few months, it wasn't actually a Series 13, but a 90-minute special called The Promised Land. And we were quite interested, I hesitate to say excited, but certainly interested, by the preview material on the internet, because it explained how, finally, we were going to meet some other cats. descendants of the cats who had left Red Dwarf on the search for the Promised Land. And as we knew, there had already been a few abandoned attempts and misused attempts to get other cats in the show, and they were finally going to do it properly. So that was certainly a good thing to do with a 90-minute special, at least in theory.
You know, I got my hopes up about that much too much. I thought, this seems like it should be a properly done ending to the whole thing. A happy ending for Cat, where he gets to be with other cats. Maybe they find their fuchsia. Maybe we're going to get Kachansky back, and maybe everybody kind of settles somewhere. Perhaps Earth, perhaps not, perhaps on some new Earth. And that'll be that, because everyone's getting rather old, and the material is getting very, very stale. And one day, Doug Naylor and all his cast will be dead, and they don't want to have still not finished it by then, do they? So I really started to hope that they might make something of it.
I said on our Red Dwarf podcast, well, they keep doing it until Robert Llewellyn dies. And as we know from the DVD special features, Robert Llewellyn actually had to take some time off filming to go into hospital with old men's waterworks problems. So will that be enough to make them realise they've perhaps been doing the show too long and trying to squeeze a bit too much life out of it? But of course, one of the shows from Series 12 or 11 was the one where there seems to be a cat, a female cat, and oh no, it's not a cat, it's a polymorph, and we're doing a whole different episode. Actually, it's not about cats at all. But it has this whole scene where Cat and the fake cat are very pleased and surprised and excited to meet each other. Ooh, another cat in person for the first time. So you would think when Cat finally does meet 3 cats in the Promised Land, you'd get a similar sort of reaction. But no, absolutely nothing. Cat's brother, like you and us. And Cat's like, oh yeah, well, I see cats every day. But this is the first time he's actually had contact with other cats since the cat priest died in Series 1. Should be a highly significant Red Dwarf moment, but it's completely brushed over. And indeed, in the end, I think the Promised Land does rather pay lip service to the cat stuff. It's there, it's driving the whole thing, but it's very badly done. One of the things we praise on our Red Dwarf podcast is the cat doing cat-like things like playing with the string, and Doug Naylor tries to get a few new ones of those into the Promised Land, and there's a couple of them we don't like because they don't make sense. We've got following the laser pointer and knocking things off the table. Yeah, that's great. They both work. They're both cat instinctive things that humanoid cats should be doing. But having a giant scratching post and a giant cat flap doesn't make sense for those particular evolved breed of cats, because why would they have a giant scratching post? Why would they have a cat flap? It's not based on anything they would have seen in Red Dwarf, anything they needed to live in Red Dwarf, any kind of instinct that's inherent in them, like chasing things and batting things. It's just large comedy cat flap and large comedy scratching post for a cheap laugh, and makes the whole thing fall apart in many ways. And it's another example of lip service paid to the cat aspect of the whole thing, which is a great shame. The thing I particularly liked in it was the new hologram technology, Diamond Light, which is the amalgamation of soft light and hard light hologram technology, which I think makes sci-fi sense. They find a ship that's a little newer than Red Dwarf, and thus it can sustain more than one hologram and has diamond light hologram technology, which is the next stage on hard light, and it would be a good way to solve the old hologram filming problems. When Rimmer has his diamond light upgrade, he can be hard light, touch things, touch people, not have to worry about doing hologram acting that Chris Barry obviously could never be bothered with. But he can also use hologrammatic powers to do stuff, like break things down into their component atoms and turn them into light and take them through walls, which is used quite effectively for the denouement of the Promised Land. And finally, Rimmer does get to save the day and be the hero without any kind of mitigation or the scene being completely cut and junked and never referred to in the narrative. I rather like that aspect. I hesitated to say earlier the thing I liked about it was the stuff they did with Rimmer. It's quite nice, some of his existential crisis he starts having, and there's the effect they have of him on low power. They make him black and white and mono sound, and it's just to do an effect, really. But it is kind of justified artistically because it backs up how he's feeling about himself, his own existence. As does the Diamond Light stuff, I suppose, coming back in at the end to save the day. But it did lead to a decent exchange between Chris Barry and Craig Charles, talking about their feelings, Rimmer and Lister's feelings and interplay, which, as we mentioned, was often the best parts of the show. The script work, I don't think, was very good, with all the stuff about Rimmer's the moon and Lister's the sun, and moonlight exists because the sun and the moon work together. I didn't think that resonated particularly, but I thought Craig Charles as Lister was particularly doing a good job of getting the emotion into the scene and getting the most out of the lines. People like you, and we know what he's trying to say, what Craig thinks Lister's trying to say. So yeah, the Rimmer and Lister interaction and Rimmer's characterization and the idea of Diamond Light and how it was eventually used in the special, I thought was good. And hopefully, if they do make more, we'll see once again Rimmer find some sort of great power source and become Diamond Light and actually use it in some way.
Another problem with it is that Doug Naylor, when writing about the cat race, either didn't bother checking or didn't care if it followed on coherently from what we learned in Series 1 about the cat race. You mentioned the cat priest earlier. He tells us quite clearly that Cat was born after all the other cats except the sick and the lame went off in the arks, and then they turn round and say that the feral leader, the main cat antagonist, is Cat's brother and they have met. If they wanted to say he was a half-brother who had been in his mummy's tummy when the arks left, that would work. But no, apparently they've met each other. This was revealed quite late on in the proceedings, and I told you how I built my hopes up very foolishly around this, and I'd experienced disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. That really was the last straw.
Yes, annoying continuity issues for real dwarfers who know the show properly were a problem there. Never before on the actual show have they fallen into the trap of saying Rimmer is a first technician like he is in the books. And I said in the Red Dwarf podcast how book continuity creeping into the show annoys me. But there it was, he refers to himself as first technician, and that's just one example. There was also quite a bit of joke recycling from earlier shows. Familiar comedy concepts from Red Dwarf done in less funny new ways. For instance, the sequence with Lister and Holly deleting the Agatha Christie books from Holly's memory is somewhat redone with Rimmer and Crichton and deleting the memory of the Iron Star derelict that starts off the whole plot, and it just doesn't work so well and isn't so funny and is rather tired. One thing they were keen to tell us about the Promised Land, of course, was that Norman Lovett does return as Holly, yet again after another reconciliation with Doug Naylor. And everything Holly was doing at the beginning was rather a rehash of the episode from Series 10, where they get a new computer, Pre, who starts screwing their lives up for them. And then the rebooted version of Holly in the Promised Land starts screwing their lives up for them, so they have to leave the ship. But then at least we did get proper Holly back at the end. But some of what he was doing with his trademark goose, I've missed, was rather forced as well. So really, Red Dwarf is very tired. If they do make another 90-minute special, they really should be finishing it off properly. But then we thought Back to Earth was going to finish it off properly, Series 10 was going to finish it off properly, Series 12 was going to finish it off properly, and it doesn't happen. For God's sake, get Chloe and Ed, get it finished before someone dies. Earlier this year, I had occasion to buy the complete Dogtanian Collector's Edition DVD box set, and included in it, as well as the two full series, was a DVD containing the movie versions of both series. And I'm sure we mentioned having watched the movie version of the first series on our Dogtanian podcast, but we didn't have very clear memories of that. We'd had it on video at one point and it got recorded over. But now we have watched and analysed and been very interested in, if not exactly enjoyed, the movie versions of both series, and it was a very revealing experience.
The movie version of Series 1 explains everything. Absolutely everything. I had been left with the impression that it was a perfectly decent adaptation of The Three Musketeers up to and including The Queen's Diamonds. I had not been left with the impression that it was much or at all better than The Return of Dogtanian. And I was, as I probably said on our Dogtanian podcast, very pleasantly surprised by the high quality of the first series. Both of us were kind of expecting an abridged version of that first series up to and including The Queen's Diamonds and then the end where D'Artagnan becomes a musketeer with the original voice recordings.
We had no reason to suppose at that point that they'd actually got the actors, some of the same, some different, in to do a whole new soundtrack for it, but they had done.
One thing that it explained was why, even though I'd kind of forgotten this, we were both, I think, a bit surprised to hear characters such as King Louis in particular being voiced by people who aren't doing the voices in The Return of Dogtanian.
Planchet is the other one, who has his Series 2 voice in the Series 1 movie version. And yes, when we first had the Series 1 videos, I had been surprised that the King and Planchet didn't have the voices from The Return of Dogtanian, but then over time we think, oh, well, that's how they were, that's how they must have been all the time, and then you don't expect to hear them in the movie version, but there they are. And then you go, oh, right, okay, so that's why I thought he was going to have that voice, but he didn't.
And by this time we had watched the first series of Dogtanian quite a few times and knew the dialogue fairly well. And then they were saying the same basic things, but translated differently and not translated so well. And thank goodness Cam Clarke was there voicing Dogtanian. Unfortunately, with the lines that he was given, he couldn't put so much quirkiness and fun into the character because the lines were generally either very straightforward, not particularly characterful, or they were nonsense because they'd been badly translated.
The one that sticks with me is peering through this keyhole is imperative, which in the episode version is translated much better and more believable. But saying it like that, which is probably a very literal translation, peering through this keyhole is imperative, is an absolutely stupid thing to say, and I'm sure Cam Clarke thought so while he was being forced to say it.
And then it turned out the translator was Dave Mallow, who translated The Return of Dogtanian, and on our Dogtanian podcast you could probably hear us basically slagging off his crappy dialogue. Actually, when we watched the whole of Dogtanian, we realised the dialogue gets much, much better as it goes on, and some of it's actually quite effective, whereas in the earlier ones, when you go to the inn and ask Planchet to bring you the house special, and he says, well, pardon me, I'll bring you some, and things like that, and it's nonsense. And we think maybe Dave Mallow got more confident to translate less literally and put a bit more characterisation in. But this movie is translated in the same sort of way as the earlier episodes of The Return of Dogtanian, i.e. not very well. And we did think that maybe, as Cam Clarke was asked to voice Dogtanian in this movie, and it's the same people working on it, he was asked to come and reprise his role in The Return of Dogtanian, and perhaps he decided he didn't have enough patience to read Dave Mallow's crappy dialogue for 26 episodes.
And wouldn't that be a shame if making One for All and All for One scared off Cam Clarke, made him say, I'm never working with Dave Mallow again, and made The Return of Dogtanian have a lot less potential to get the best out of it than it otherwise could have done?
There was also a movie version of The Return of Dogtanian, a contracted, re-translated, re-voiced movie, which was basically finding the king and swapping him back with his evil twin Blancbec annoying the Duke of Bavaria, and the King and the Muskehound talking him round. Oh, that bit where Alexei gives Sandy a rejuvenating potion didn't fit in quite so seamlessly with the rest. The kidnapping of Dogtanian's daughter Fleur, and then in the end, Dogtanian becoming leader of the Guard, which sounded like quite a good idea, the bits that you really need and you could make a decent movie out of. We did think it was likely to make more sense with the kind of meandering and hanging about and not actually doing anything about the problem cut. And I suppose in a way it did, although we also thought that there were some bits cut that ought to be included to make it make more sense.
The runtime only came in at about 1:15, and we were saying it would have been a good idea to have an extra 15 minutes on the runtime to get in perhaps Alexei doing the arguably more important thing, more significant to the actual plot thing of saving the king when Blancbec arranges to have him poisoned, as well as saving Sandy, which is also important, and have some more of the stuff where Fleur comes home and is reunited with Juliet. That's very brushed over. You see Philippe and Fleur together at the ball to celebrate Dogtanian becoming the captain of the Muskehounds. We haven't seen Fleur since she was being held at knife point. It would have been a good idea just to pad that bit out.
Speaking of holding Fleur at knife point, we wanted to see more of Bugeaud when he was threatening to stab her. We were saying, well, we really haven't seen enough of him in this film to know if we believe that or not, that he would go through with it.
If we've watched the whole series and he's going to Dogtanian, think I won't harm her? We're like, oh no, we know you would. But yeah, in the movie version, he's really just been skulking in the shadows and being very subservient to Blancbec and not doing his evil, ruthless stuff that he enjoys so much. It lost a lot of the impact. Again, that could have been something to add to the runtime. Just a bit of Bugeaud actually being Bugeaud leading up to that point with Fleur.
Bugeaud is such an asset to this show. In a way, it's a shame to do that to him in this film, but in a way it's not, because the whole thing is not particularly well done. I don't think they had a great deal of money. So the actors, though they aren't exactly bad, the performances are not characterful, and the dialogue is very plain. Now, I know that flowery, over-embellished dialogue is worse than that, but I suppose it's the dialogue too hasn't really got character in it. They're just talking about what's going on. They're not saying it in any particular way. It's hard to tell one voice from another, and I did think, in a way, it made Dogtanian more likeable than he was in the series The Return of Dogtanian, because Dave Mallow makes him sound like such a stupid knob, whereas whoever was playing him in this film made him sound just very ordinary. So there wasn't really anything wrong with him, but then compare him to Cam Clarke's performance, there wasn't really anything right with him either. I thought the children's voices were a lot better in the series, particularly, even though they are voiced by adults, the two women who perform in that series, and they're never going to be as good as a real child like you get in the Mysterious Cities of Gold. I thought they did do perfectly good child impressions with perfectly good child characterization, and whereas it really struck me in this film, particularly when Fleur is being held at knife point, she's really too much like an adult, and she's too articulate when in distress. In the series, she's just crying and wailing and when he picks her up, whereas in this film she's saying, oh, let me go, and I didn't think it ran very true at all. And by that point I was really starting to think, in the series, the things that they say, and Rebecca Forstadt's performance as Fleur, and the interplay between the characters is actually quite effective, and actually quite well written by Dave Mallow at that point. And I thought, comparing the film to the series, it kind of got worse as it went on, because at the start you're remembering all the nonsense that they talk and think, okay, this is making more sense, and then it goes on, and in the series it gets better, and in the film it stays at the same level, and you really start to notice. So that was when it struck me. Dave Mallow does get into it a bit more, and you end up with some quite effective scenes towards the end of the series.
We were joking when we were just having a whiz through that Series 2 movie version when we first got the DVD. They've just got some people off the streets to dump this over. We were laughing at a bit of dialogue that seemed rather stupid. I can't believe our friend Dogtanian bought a new horse, which seemed like a very silly way to comment on Sandy's newfound vigour. But actually, when we sat and watched it, the dialogue and the voices weren't as bad as that one particular bit seemed to indicate. But certainly, yes, as we've explained, plenty of room for improvement, but a very interesting viewing experience nonetheless. Now, the interesting thing was, in addition to the Dogtanian Collector's Edition, I also had occasion to buy, in the same Amazon order, Around the World with Willy Fog, the kind of spiritual and definitely financial, practical successor to Dogtanian and the Three Musky Hounds first series. We watched the first episode of Willy Fog as a DVD extra on a Dogtanian DVD many, many years ago and enjoyed it. And at last, we've now watched the rest of the series. I think it would be very inaccurate to say I didn't enjoy Willy Fog, but it's certainly not as good as Dogtanian, and it's certainly very weird in a lot of ways, and it's certainly a very interesting viewing experience than a very enjoyable one.
I think it had its own particular charm. Around the World in 80 Days is not a book I've read. It would be quite interesting to compare sometime, but I did read about it when watching Around the World with Willy Fog. And I think the thing that really stops it from making sense is the character Transfer, who they've invented for this series, who is the saboteur. He's actually trying to stop Willy Fog and friends from getting around the world in 80 days to win this bet. And so things happen like he sends them chasing off after Tico's passport, Tico being the show's answer to Pip, and also delaying their ship, giving them time to go and find Tico's passport. And then when they get on the ship, they're saying, oh, can you go faster? I'll give you lots of money to go faster. And I'm thinking, well, because they've been delayed, they're only making up time. And then suddenly Willy Fog turns around and says they're 2 days ahead of schedule.
As we discovered in the book, he's only being followed by a detective from Scotland Yard who's trying to arrest him on British soil. And in Around the World with Willy Fog, you get Inspector Dix and Constable Bully, obviously more than one detective this time, so they can talk to each other. They kind of make less sense. They're not trying to intercept him when he gets to British-owned places. They're following him the entire way through the jungle and so on. There's no way they'd have survived it in real life. And they even overtake Willy Fog and his party at one point when they've fallen into this crocodile-infested river. The next we see them, they're waiting for Willy Fog in Bombay or wherever it is. So they kind of got around the world in 79 days more quickly than he did.
And that kind of thing happens to Transfer too, doesn't it?
When he goes over Niagara Falls, and you think, no way he survived that. And the next we see of him, he's at the station in New York, perfectly all right.
And yet it's such a struggle for Willy Fog and friends to do the same things in quite a lot more time.
I was very interested to read that there's no hot air balloon in the book. Of course, it's a whole different Jules Verne book, 5 weeks in a balloon. And that was one of the things where you read about it and think, oh, that will make more sense in the book. They accidentally end up in Mexico and use the hot air balloon to get to San Francisco. Geographically, practically, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Of course that doesn't happen in the book. But I think they just about get away with that. Perhaps you can't get across Mexico and travel easily to Europe in those days. But when they think they're going to Bordeaux instead of Liverpool, and then they're like, oh, when we get to Bordeaux, how are we going to get to Liverpool? I think that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. If you're in France and you're trying to get to London, you're not going to go to Liverpool before you go to London, are you? You're going to go to Southampton or Dover, or even like Michael Palin did, Felixstowe, and go to London from there. You're not going to go out of your way. And that bit where they're saying Liverpool's the nearest port to manipulate the captain into saying, oh yes, sail there then. Does Ireland not exist in this universe?
One thing that was both nonsensical and quite amusing was when Transfer decided he had it in for Tico and Rigadon, who is voiced by Cam Clark, actually, and is the character who's based on Passepartout, which I think is a name pretty much everyone knows from the book. Phileas Fogg's butler, assistant, valet sort of thing. And there was even a stage where Willy Fog and Romy, the Indian lady who they rescue from her husband's funeral pyre, are off going round the world, and Transfer really ought to be stopping them, and he's making Rigadon and Tico do intensive labour, and he's planning on making them be in this circus knife act so he can kill them. In fact, I think that's what he's going to do to Rigadon, and he's going to shoot Tico out of the cannon. And then Willy Fog and Romy turn up at the circus, and Tico says, "Oh, Rigadon, Mr. Fog and Romy are here," and instead of saying, "Oh good, now we can all leave," which is what you thought they ought to say, they carry on and nearly get killed in this knife throwing act, and it was at once baffling and quite amusing, which I suppose is what I mean by it's got its own particular charm.
It was a bit disappointing, that rescue of Romy bit, wasn't it? We'd been anticipating it for some time. It's obviously a major point in the series. They don't do anything. They get to the point where they should be doing something and actually going to rescue her, and they're just sitting in the bushes watching her burn. It's thanks to the fact that Rigadon has been a bit headstrong and rather gone against Mr. Fogg's orders that he's actually gone and started doing something and started rescuing her. If Rigadon hadn't done that, nobody would have done anything about it until it was too late. So that was very weird from a plot and structure point of view. And of course in the recap, it looks like they've done it deliberately and coordinated it properly and used the elephant at the right time to come and get her out of there. It's a bit like the recap of Superman the movie at the start of Superman 2. They make it look like they've done it properly, but when you watch the whole thing, you think, oh dear, that's not quite the ticket, is it?
I remember we were saying, no, Rigadon, don't be a fool, wait for the others. And I think in pretty much any other show we'd be right to say that, but this time the others weren't doing anything.
If it made more sense, it would be a lot better, but it's still a lot of fun to watch. We were enjoying some amusing bits, some amusing pieces of acting. Cam Clark with his French accent being Rigadon saying, "Oh, my references," when they blow away in the first episode, and "Bonsoir, monsieur, I am drunk and falling over." We enjoyed Tico with his "Leave me alone, I'm dreaming about a pizza."
I think one moment that deserves an honourable mention is the sick, possibly dying princess, who's a pig, and the protagonists hear about her from this monkey. Oh, our princess is very sick, she's dying. And then suddenly Romy is the doctor, and she doctors other characters after this happens as well. So the pig princess is getting better, and then along comes this monkey saying, "Oh, my love, you're well." And we're going, she's your love, is she? We didn't get that at all from what he said. Or the fact that he's a monkey and she's a pig.
And that episode ends with Romy kind of manipulating the king into letting the monkey and the pig get married. And we're like, oh, we didn't realise that was where it was headed, but okay. I was finding it particularly interesting when we were being told, Fog was telling Rigadon all about the various recent developments in travel and new tunnels and ship services and things, which very much mirror real history, and it is a very interesting concept. It's a whole new thing. Get around the world in 80 days using public transport. Rigadon comes to realise, oh, so we couldn't have done this even like 3 years ago. Willy Fog's like, that's right. And actually, they're trying to do it a bit early, as they discover when they realise that the railway line from Calcutta to Bombay hasn't been completed. There's an 80-mile gap in it, which they have to complete on the elephant where they find Romy, so it's all for the best, really. But it's very good, isn't it? When Rigadon's having a go at the guy on the train. You sold us a ticket through from Bombay to Calcutta. How can you do that when there's 80 miles of track missing? The guy's like, oh, well, yeah, the ticket is sold with the assumption that passengers will make their own way across that 80 miles. And Rigadon's very cross about that, and rightly so. They don't tell you that at the station.
What a precedent that sets. All sorts of crap like that happens when you try and travel. Quite relatable too then, that bit, isn't it?
And the last thing we have to update you on this year is Grange Hill. When we did our Grange Hill podcast quite some time ago, we talked quite a lot about series 1, 2, 3, and 4, which had been out on DVD for quite some time. But then within the last couple of years, a company called Eureka Entertainment has actually been releasing series 5 onwards on DVD. We don't know how far they're going to get with it, but what an interesting experience it has been for us so far, watching series 5, 6, 7, and 8. I remember saying in the Grange Hill podcast that series 4 seemed perhaps to be a bit of a dip and getting a bit tired, and maybe series 5 would inject some new life into it, New Year 7, and really get things cooking. But actually, we've decided series 5, 6, 7, 8 are a bit of a slump, or quite a bad slump, actually. I wonder if it has anything to do with the fact that Phil Redmond, who obviously created Grange Hill, wasn't really involved with them. He doesn't have any writing or storyline credits, and I think it's probably because he was off making Tucker's Luck during that sort of time, and concentrating on the characters he really liked, with good reason. Tucker, Alan, and friends, and he'd kind of left Grange Hill to fester somewhat. Series 5 was rather badly handled. I'd always found it a bit strange, having looked up and discovered that it didn't really make very much use of the old original cast, original year group as 5th years. They're in like 1 or 2 episodes each. Tucker, Alan, Benny, Trisha, Kathy, Justin, and it mainly concentrates on what has become the 3rd year with Pogo, Dwayne, Stewpot, Claire, Precious, and friends, and then introduces quite a famous year group with Roland, Zamo, Annette, Faye, and in early days, Jonah. And the trouble with Series 5 is it seems to have a status quo that every episode starts with, and then different writers have come back to it, and you can't really take the storyline on very far. So the issues it's trying to explore about Ripper and his bullying, Roland and his various problems settling into school, Mr. McGuffey and his slightly unconventional yet popular way of teaching, don't actually move on at all. How many times did somebody say to Gripper, right, you come along to my office and I'm going to sort you out? And then he's back doing exactly the same things, bullying people, stealing money, and nothing really moves on. It was very strange, very stagnant. And the same was true of Series 6, really. I think it was a bit better than Series 5. It did bring the Gripper stuff to a head. There was a whole race war thing going on. And when you see clips of that on YouTube and things, and all the guys gang up on Gripper, and Mr. Baxter almost decides to let them beat the crap out of Gripper in the toilets, and then says, I have to step in and stop it, lads. You think, oh, that must have had some good build-up. But actually, there's really nothing to the build-up, and it's rather badly mishandled. But it did have its moments. I do like Mr. McGuffey as a teacher. I think he has a lot of passion and cares very much. I was saying at first he'd be better off teaching adults who are really interested and want to learn, but actually he managed to speak to a lot of the students in the end. I like the bit where he'd said to the first years as they were then, you can write anything you want, be as honest as you want. And then, of course, when Mr. Keating was covering the lesson, saw how honest Jonah had been about what he thought of the assignment, Mr. Keating didn't approve of that at all. Everyone was assuring him, oh yes, Mr. McGuffey says we can write whatever we want, and Mr. Keating's like, did he really? How very unwise of him. Which sort of made me think, yeah, perhaps he would be better off with adults. But no, he's actually a very valued and valuable teacher in the end. We were quite enjoying in those 2 series, Zamo and Jonah as a double act, weren't we?
Yes, I thought Jonah was particularly appealing.
And who can blame him for not wanting to come back to Series 7 so they could drown him? And there is a student death that we missed out of our list of student deaths in the podcast because we didn't know about it yet. But Jeremy in Series 7 is the other student death. And he's introduced in Series 6 as Jonah's cousin. And then he comes to Grange Hill instead of Jonah in in Series 7. And that, like in Series 4, is one of those bits where there's a character who's obviously supposed to be another character. He's only just started at Grange Hill, Jeremy, and yet he's cockily hanging around with Stu Pot and the other 50ers talking about computers and so on. Actually, in Series 6, there was nothing wrong with Jeremy. He was perfectly nice, perfectly personable, perfectly friendly to Zamo and Jonah. But then they made him absolutely awful in Series 7. First of all, he was making a fake bus pass using Zamo's bus pass, manipulating Zamo in that way. And then it culminated in everyone was horrible to him, and then he drowned, and everyone was feeling guilty, and Zamo was feeling particularly guilty, although it didn't make him turn to drugs yet. But wouldn't it have been awful to see that with Zamo and Jonah after their wonderful friendship that they had?
It was the direction they were taking Jonah in, wasn't it? He was starting to go around annoying everybody. His boyish cockiness was going from charming to somewhat antisocial.
A mistake they didn't make with Tucker, who he's kind of the new version of. But then Series 7 was rather stagnant, and when we'd watched a few episodes of it, I suddenly realised, we were due a new first year, and we haven't got them. So really, it's 3 whole series, 5, 6 and 7, of the same 2 year groups doing pretty much the same thing over and over again. You get a bit of respite in Series 5, as I say, with limited appearances from Tucker and friends, but really Series 5 is mainly those 2 year groups, and 6 and 7, it's all those 2 year groups. There was a bit that was almost good towards the end of Series 7, where Roland and friends went orienteering, and Roland and Mr. Baxter were bonding. They never really got on before, but that was very good. And finally, Roland was coming across as a real person with real feelings, and we were finding him very entertaining. When he was saying to Mr. Baxter, we found this marker for orienteering, whatever it is, I reckon we could get a good time here, sir, and things. And then when Roland had kind of saved the day by having them found, and Mr. Baxter had hurt his ankle, and everyone in the class was going, oh yay, Rolly's a hero, we thought, maybe everyone will be nice to Roland after that. But no, it wasn't to be.
I do remember thinking when every episode was just Roland's getting bullied by Gripper, by Annette, whoever, everyone basically. I don't care, I thought, because Roland is not a nice child. He doesn't say anything or do anything to make you like him. And then, as you were saying, next series he's given the chance to shine, and the actor is given a chance to put a bit more into the performance, and it comes across really well.
But I was speculating perhaps the reason they put off having a New Year 7 first year in Series 7 was they knew they were going to be moving to BBC Elstree Studios for Series 8, and they were kind of waiting to refresh the show with the New Year 7 then, which perhaps makes a certain amount of sense. And in many ways Series 8 is refreshed with the merging of the 2 schools. Grange Hill had already merged with another school. And there were some bits in Series 8 that we did enjoy. A couple of them involving Zamo getting impatient with the French exchange student. I don't do physique, mate. And of course, when he saw Callie getting kidnapped, that's a Grange Hill girl. She's being kidnapped. Zamo made that very engaging. And I was quite pleased to see in Series 8 some more familiar teachers. Miss Booth, the art teacher, Mr. Mackenzie, the woodwork teacher, and of course, very famous Mr. Bronson debuts in Series 8, and I do find him very entertaining to watch. I wouldn't want to have him as a teacher, and you can see how he picks out his victims, and he does victimize certain students. He does it with Zamo. He unreasonably bullies Zamo because he doesn't like him, and Zamo's not particularly good at French and doesn't really concentrate for him. But of course he's going to end up having the big storyline, having picked out and victimized Danny Kendall in time to come, which leads on to Danny's death. Doesn't cause Danny's death, but it's a whole big thing with Danny and Mr. Bronson. You can see the seeds of it being sown there. But he's a very striking and very memorable and I think very entertaining character. He came over from the posh school Rodney Bennett and Grange Hill had merged with in Series 8, which makes a lot of sense because he expects very high standards that perhaps Grange Hill students aren't used to being expected to live up to. So it may be a bit of a transition series towards what is regarded as the peak. Series 8 is from 1985, of course 1986 has the whole Zamo drugs just say no thing. That's probably the most famous thing from Grange Hill's history. The new first years in Series 8 are ones that were very familiar to me more when they were older. I remember them from when I was little and from the vintage Grange Hill repeats very well. But when I saw it was going to be the likes of Gaunch, Robbie, Trevor, Callie and Ronnie, I thought, oh yes, I know who all that lot are. They're actually Mr. Robson's first form when they're in the fourth year. And there they all were, looking very fresh-faced and young and perhaps starting to get into it. When I was reading some Series 8 blurbs before we actually watched it, and it was talking about Gaunch and his scheme to sell things off the rubbish dump, I had a bit of a, oh, well, you could just replace that with Pogo and it'd be exactly the same thing. Hopefully it's not going to be too repetitive.
It kind of was, though, wasn't it? Pogo by another name and very repetitive, and reading about what's coming up in the future, it seems like it's going to stay that way, which is a bit of a shame. I didn't remember Gaunch at all from before, but I remember our mum used to talk about him. She liked him, and at first I couldn't see anything in him. But again, it's the material the actor is given. When he got something quite amusing to do, playing the tape with which he'd bug the staff room to the staff and talking about how their conversation is boring and stuff like that, it was actually quite amusing, and I could see the appeal of that child.
There was that very funny bit on the tape, wasn't there? Mr. Smart and the art teacher who he's having a thing with have finished all the coffee. That's the third time this week you've finished all the coffee, Mr. Baxter says, when he comes in.
The other person in that year group at that time who perhaps doesn't stick around is Hollow. And it was hearing them discussing their names, people call me Gaunch, people call me Hollow, that made me realise how annoying I find it that whoever comes up with these characters thinks that the boys just have to nickname each other. You've got Tucker in the first year group we ever meet, and then you've got Pogo, then you've got Zamo and Jonah. Now there's Gaunch and Hollow, and coming along in the future is Ziggy, isn't it? And not only that, but they nickname all the male teachers, and I think some of the female teachers, Sexy Lexi certainly, and Bullet and Smarty Pants and Scruffy McGuffy, and I find it very unrealistic, because when I was at school, no one ever nicknamed anybody, whereas our parents and aunts and people used to talk about teachers having nicknames and people in their class having nicknames, but I do think by the 80s it really had stopped.
Hollow made us laugh, didn't he, when Gaunch had this stupid scheme about showing videos at lunchtime, and Hollow's assessment of one of the videos was Superman free, wicked! And as you can perhaps tell from our quite recent Superman podcast, we, and probably everyone in the world except Hollow, do not have that reaction to Superman free.
A big thing that was going on in that series was Stewpot, there we go, another nickname, two-timing Annette and Claire, which sounded kind of annoying when we just read it in the blurb, but then when we saw it, it was so weird, because he doesn't seem to like either of them very much. He's always fobbing off one to be with the other, and then just not engaging, doesn't seem to want to be there.
I was saying, do they want us to ship Stewpot and Claire, really pull for them? Are they supposed to be the new Alan and Susie? It's really not happening. I've actually been wondering if yet again, after Series 8, there's another 2 whole years without a new Year 7, a new first year, because it's at the beginning of the 1988 series, along with Mr. Robson, that people like Justine and Chrissy and Tegs arrive. So either they're starting the 1 year off New Year 7's 2 years off, or, again, you've got 2 years off, 1 year off, which may indicate perhaps that the show may stagnate a little. In the latest box set release of Series 9 and 10, which we will be watching in the near future and may perhaps update you about in the future.
One thing that has been bothering me with these last few series is that many, if not all, of the writers come at it with the view that CYPs are bad. They're trying to get one over on each other. They're always in conflict with each other. It's not just Jonah, although Jonah was in that Chessington Zoo episode in which all the Grange Hill party had a pointless rivalry with this posh boys' school party. The two school parties arrive, take one look at each other and decide they're going to steal each other's bags and trick each other into climbing on the dinosaurs and get into trouble. It's that year group, really, mainly that they do it with. You've got Annette just being horrible to everybody, including her friends. And what really annoyed me was when some writer was doing it with Precious. Precious is the most sensible student in the whole thing. She's very sensibly got herself a Saturday job sweeping up in a hairdresser's. And this writer decides that she's going to tell everyone a lie to impress them that she's learning how to cut hair. And then, which is also completely out of character, she agrees to cut the hair of one of her contemporaries. And of course messes it up because she can't do it. And not only did I refuse to believe that it would get that far, I refused to believe with a character like Precious that it would have even started. She would be perfectly happy to say truthfully, I've got a Saturday job at a hairdresser's, I sweep up, I don't cut hair. And I thought such things were a disservice to young people, to suggest that they were always at odds, having these rivalries, one-upmanship, whether it's suited to the character or not.
That's so true, and it was particularly disappointing, that Chessington one, wasn't it? Because Samo and Jonah were doing some very good work together, and all that stuff where Jonah was getting changed and Samo was covering for him, and they were stuck in the toilet cubicle together while the zookeeper was looking for Jonah, had a lot of potential, but it just wasn't realised. And of course, Mr. Sutcliffe and Miss Mooney are all over that episode with their awfully boring, stupid, on-again, off-again engagement, which was another thing the show really could have done without. So yes, definitely a verdict there of a real slump for series 5, 6, 7, really 8, possibly some green shoots of recovery, and watch this space to see how we assess things go on from there. In the meantime, hopefully you've enjoyed this update podcast, and don't forget to join us again for our next regular podcast on the final Sunday in February. Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.